Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on what time of day you're watching this. Welcome to the 10-Minute Sales Multiplier Formula. You'll see on your screen, actually, my latest book, The Sales Multiplier Formula, hence the name of this live stream, is now available on Amazon and all great places if you're an avid reader. So make sure you grab your copy today to dive more deeply into what we're going to discuss. My name is Shawn Casemore. I appreciate you joining me here for the 10-Minute Sales Multiplier. Today, I want to talk about a fairly straightforward, I'm not going to say simple, but a fairly straightforward way to increase your sales by 30%, if not more. Now, last week during this 10-Minute Sales Multiplier, you recall we talked about cross sells, and many of you contacted me, which you can do, by the way, info@ShawnCasemore.com, and you shared the different cross sells that you're using, how effective they've been or not. Some of you even gave some feedback to some ideas on how to improve them. But today I want to talk about something else. If we've addressed cross sells, if you now have a list of complementary cross sells, as I like to call them, and you're mentioning those to prospective clients or customers, the next thing I want you to consider is that you also need to have some upsells. And you can see how we're building out whatever it is you sell. So if you're selling commercial insurance, we're adding on products, complementary cross sells, right? If you're selling equipment, we're adding on complementary maybe service packages, okay? So we've talked last week about how to build on that initial sale with cross sells, but let's now focus on the upsell. To be clear, however, I find people get cross sells and upsells confused sometimes. So let me just give you a real quick definition of the upsell that I'm referring to. Think of it as a premium version of what you're offering. Okay, so a cross sell is a complementary product or service, whereas an upsell more complements what it is you're selling as the main item. Okay, so an upsell of French fries would be a larger French fry. A cross sell might be a strawberry shake. Okay, there's a simple analogy for you that a lot of people actually use a lot to show the differences between the two. Now, I know you know what an upsell is, but what I want to talk about today is actually how you can plant upsells strategically in the sales conversation to improve or increase your chances of closing the upsell. And in fact, I'll even argue this, that if you're offering upsells with whatever it is you're selling, product or service, you in fact can actually improve your closing ratio because you're likely offering something that's just a little bit different than what your competitors are. Okay. But that said, let's talk about upsells and how to strategically plant seeds throughout the conversation with your prospects. So there are 5 different times, that you should be mentioning, asking questions about, sharing examples of upsells. I know I get that wrong at some point today. Upsells to your prospects. Okay, so let's walk through the 5 times. First off, in your initial conversation with a prospect. So I'm going to take the common sales process and simplify. So for you, for example, you may have multiple meetings over multiple years in order to get to the opportunity to provide a quote or proposal and close. Or you may have a 115-minute meeting that leads to the opportunity to close. So let's just break it down into very simple chunks. You've typically got some sort of initial conversation with your prospect. Then you've got a more serious, in-depth discovery discussion. Sometimes those two happen at the same time. Sometimes they're separate. Sometimes there's multiple in between. Then you've got the actual proposal or quote that you share, and you should be introducing a meeting to review that with the prospect. More on that in just a minute. Then you've got the after effects. So that's where you reconnect, you discuss, you maybe negotiate, maybe deal with some objections and attempt to close. So if you think about your sales process from that standpoint, and we're simplifying it a bit here, here's what I want you to consider. In the very first conversations with your prospects, you should be mentioning upsell opportunities. Now, I'm going to use some common examples here that I think most people can relate to because I'm not really sure what you're selling. So it's going to be hard for me, obviously, to speak to that. But let's take something like a car. Most people have bought or leased or borrowed a car at some point in their life or had the experience of buying or leasing a car. So if you're to buy a car, okay, when you first interact with that prospect, so they call in, they send an email, maybe you have a phone call with them, maybe they come on the car lot. What I want you to consider is that you need to mention the upsell option or the opportunity, okay? So you might be explaining the car and saying, we have other vehicles with some additional features. Let me just show you a different vehicle than this, very similar in whatever ways it's similar, but also some additional features that I think you might appreciate, right? So I would take you to another car, maybe similar model, similar brand, but with some additional features like, I don't know, heated steering wheel, heated rear seats, whatever, right? That is ultimately an upsell. Costs more, but with that more, you get more stuff, okay? So in that example, I want to mention very early on when we're having the initial conversation and you're trying to understand why they reached out to you, what's important to them, what are their objectives, what are they trying to achieve, et cetera, et cetera. You want to mention that there are different options that they can consider, and you want to start to just mention briefly some of the differences in those options. Okay, so we're not going to dedicate 20 minutes to droning on about an upsell. We're just simply going to mention, hey, there are some other options. Here's some language I like to use. So you know me, I like to give you exact language that you can try out in that initial conversation. Let's use the car example, but you'll have to convert that. Let's say to the prospect, you mentioned something about, well, yes, absolutely, we've got that vehicle you're looking for, Mr. or Mrs. Smith. There are often many of our customers actually decide to look at this other model just because there's a few unique items, few unique features that it has that the first model doesn't. So as we move forward, we'll maybe take a look at those two, just so I can show you the differences. So notice I'm not getting them to consider it, I'm simply mentioning it. So that's what I want you to do in that first conversation, okay? The next conversation you have is going to be more the in-depth discovery conversation. Now, again, that may be part of that first meeting, or it may be some subsequent meeting down the line. But during the discovery meeting, I want you to mention in more detail, a little more detail, not a lot, but a little bit, the upsell options. So when you're asking them, so what's important to you? What are your objectives? What are you trying to achieve? Why is now the right time? All the questions that you go through in discovery, I want you to include a couple of questions about upsells. So for example, one of the questions might be, what are some additional features you'd like to have if the opportunity arose? And of course, if it fits your budget. There's a good question you can include. And of course, you're pointing them towards an upsell. Another question you might ask is, if there was no real restriction here relative to timing, budget, and you'll have to determine what word to use depending on the earlier conversation, what other features or options would you like to see that would help you make a more informed decision? Right? So there's more language you can use. So that's more specific language questions that you'll ask during the discovery process you're trying to learn. The other thing you can add in there during the discovery process, because you built some trust and now you're having a better conversation, is when they answer that question, give them a very quick example of another client or customer of yours that actually bought that upsell option. So let's go back. Let's say I use the question with you, something to the extent of, if there were no restrictions relative to budget and time, what would some additional features be that you would appreciate? And you explain those features, again, depending on what I'm selling, or I'm selling a service, right? Some additional options. And after you explain them, I say, you know what? I had a client just last month that was in the very same situation as yourself. They decided to go with this different option that I'm going to show you just because it did address those things. It was a better long-term solution. So that little phrase is an example of what I want you to use when they answer your upsell questions. I want you to give them some social proof. Somebody else similar to them at some point in your career has bought this other model, this improved service, because of X. Okay, so use that, because that's reinforcing to them, oh, okay, good, I'm not alone. Maybe that is something, if they considered it, maybe I should consider it. So that's step 2. Okay, step 3, you'll know from, if you've ever followed me, and if you haven't, by the way, make sure you click follow on LinkedIn. I publish a lot of content here, so if you enjoy content, you'll hopefully enjoy at least some of it. So make sure you follow me. But if you do follow me at all, you'll know I'm a big fan of, before you issue that quote or that proposal, you say to the client or the customer the following: there's going to be some things in our quote, right, or in our proposal that may not make sense. So before I send this to you, I'd like to just book a few minutes in your calendar next, whatever, give them 3 to 4 business days after you send them the quote or proposal, just to go through a couple things and highlight them to you. Would you have a few minutes Tuesday morning at 10, or how about Wednesday afternoon at 1? So you give them 2 options, about 5 business days after you expect to send the quote. Now, just to reaffirm, you've not yet sent the quote. So this may be something you actually mention at the end of the discovery meeting if it's agreed upon the next step is a quote. But regardless, I want you to book that meeting. The reason for that is that avoids your prospect ghosting you. They disappear into Never Never Land. And it gives you a chance to walk through and likely explain some things where there's often objections that you want to deal with. Okay. So that's step 3. When you're in that meeting that you've pre-booked to review the proposal, you're going to mention the upsells, which you've put in the proposal. And when you put them in the proposal, I want you to add them on, right? Define, here's the main thing you're looking for, and here's the upsell options, upsell benefits, upsell features, whatever you want to call them. Number 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever makes the most sense to you. I'd like you to make sure you include them in your quote or proposal, even if they haven't said that's what I want. Give them what they want, and then give them these additional. And then in this meeting, you review them. So that's step 3 of planting seeds. Step 4 is during negotiation, which again may happen during that meeting. I often find when you do that meeting, it turns into negotiation and you actually increase the speed by which you close, because it forces them to look at the quote or proposal, forces them to have some questions for you. You can answer them and then move this forward. That's why that meeting, that proposal review meeting I mentioned is so important. But during this meeting, okay, or after, if they need more time to review, what I want you to do is follow up with them and give them an example, again, of somebody else who's taken one of those additional options. So, Shawn, I wanted to follow up with you and share with you an example of a company or example of a past client of ours who has used this other option that I mentioned and I included in our proposal. Now, when you do this, again, you're giving social proof. You're reinforcing the benefit to them to move to this other option. How you do this is oftentimes simply through a testimonial. So take your existing customers or clients that have bought some of your upsell options and always make sure you ask for a testimonial. Then you can use that as an example. If you don't have testimonials, but you have a great customer or client who has bought your upsell and you've got a good relationship with, you can potentially use them as a referral. Okay. Now, here's the rule. If you're going to use them as a reference, you want to make sure you get their approval first, and you don't use this with everybody. But if you think it's close, you'd say, hey, I'm happy to introduce you to Bob, who's bought this in the past. If you're deciding you'd like to proceed, I'll make the introduction just to help you make a final decision. Okay, so that's step 4. It's post-proposal issue, post the meeting where you've reviewed the proposal. I'm going to circle back with some social proof to reinforce the value and benefit the upsells can bring towards that initial objectives, desires that the client or customer had or the prospect had. The 5th and final is upon initial delivery. Now, this depends on what you're selling. If I'm selling something that has different payment terms over a period of time, this might be at the first payment. If I'm delivering a service that has multiple steps or stages, this might be at the point of the first service. This is actually a very good follow-up to use once that initial step is taken. So again, that's really going to depend on what you're selling, but take a look at what you sell and ask yourself, after they've signed the agreement or after they've given us a PO, what is a good time for me to check in on them, see how things are going, that I can also mention the upsell, that it's not too late to get them there. Now, this again is a little bit tricky depending on what you sell, because you may say, well, jeepers, once we've started building this thing, we can't go back and add those features. And that's fair. But oftentimes you'll find there will be a time between they signed the quote or proposal or issued me a PO, and here's what you get. Here's when you get it. There'll be time in there you can check in, give them a quick update on how things are going, ask them how things are progressing if something's already started, and re-mention, hey, you know what? I was thinking about our conversation that we had about a month ago. Wanted to follow up. Yeah, I know you didn't take that other option, that other feature that we talked about. I'm just curious, is there a reason why? So now I go in and just try and clarify why they didn't take it. You can also do this right at the point of close if you'd like, where they say, we're going to take option 1, or we're going to take that first main option. And you say, may I ask a question? Why have you decided not to take feature number 2? Why have you decided not to take package number 2? Okay, so this 5th step is really right at the time of close and sign, or slightly after, where you circle back and try one more time. So what I want you to notice is that an upsell isn't a one-time event. It's a multi-step approach that you put into your sales process, because that's what it takes to get to the upsell. You've got to educate and orient your prospect around the benefits and value that your upsells can bring, so that they can justify in their own mind or even internal to their own company as to the additional investment it will take. But the effort is well worth the reward. As I mentioned before, studies have shown upsells can generate more income. It can increase your sales revenue by like 30% and give you more margin as a result. So try those 5 steps out. Let me know how they work for you. And if you've got upsells that work great for you, make sure you email me, info@ShawnCasemore.com. Be happy to reply. And if you've got topics you'd like me to cover in a future 10-minute sales multiplier, you can email me there as well, info@ShawnCasemore.com. In the meantime, let's get out there and let's go sell something. We'll talk to you soon. Take care.